My husband threw my suitcase on the lawn and changed the locks while his girlfriend watched from our bedroom window. Neighbors filmed everything. I didn't cry. I called one number. A man showed up in 20 minutes. My husband came outside yelling. The man showed him papers. My husband's face went white. He looked at the house. Then at me. The suitcase landed on the front lawn with a dull thud that seemed to echo through the entire neighborhood. I stood on the sidewalk, my work badge still clipped to my scrubs, watching my husband Derek drag the second bag, the one with the broken wheel, across the porch. He didn't even bother carrying it. Just shoved it hard enough that it tumbled down the 3 concrete steps and spilled open, my mother's quilt tangling with my winter boots. "You're done here," he said, loud enough for Mrs. Patterson 3 houses down to hear. Loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is my house now. My life. You can figure out your own." Behind him, framed perfectly in our bedroom window, the window that overlooked the garden my mother planted 15 years ago, stood Vanessa, Derek's coworker. The woman he'd introduced me to at last year's office holiday party, the one who'd squeezed my hand and told me how lucky Derek was to have such a supportive wife during these difficult times. She wasn't even trying to hide. She wore one of my robes, the blue one I'd gotten for my birthday, and she held a coffee mug. My coffee mug. The one that said "World's Best Daughter," that Mom gave me the Christmas before her diagnosis. I heard the clicks before I saw the phones. Mr. Kowalski from next door. The retired couple across the street. Even Jenny Morrison, who usually kept to herself, had stepped onto her porch with her cell phone raised. They were all recording. Documenting. Bearing witness to what Derek assumed was my humiliation. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't collapse or beg or give them the show Derek clearly expected. Instead, I pulled out my phone and made one call. A number I'd saved under "home emergency" 3 months ago, back when I'd first started noticing the signs. Back when Derek's late nights had become overnights, when his cologne changed brands, when he stopped asking about my day. "This is Sarah Mitchell," I said calmly, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "The locks have been changed. I need you here now." The man on the other end didn't ask questions. 20 minutes. Don't engage. Just wait. Derek was already heading back inside, probably to celebrate his conquest with Vanessa. Probably to laugh about how easily he'd taken everything. The house we'd lived in for 8 years. The house where we'd hosted Thanksgiving dinners and birthday parties. The house where my mother had spent her final months, hooked up to oxygen watching the hospice nurses come and go. The house Derek thought belonged to him. I sat down on my suitcase right there on the lawn and waited. Mrs. Patterson hurried over with a folding chair and a bottle of water. She didn't say anything, just set them beside me and squeezed my shoulder. Mr. Kowalski stayed on his porch, but he was still recording. I caught his eye and he nodded once, deliberately. Jenny Morrison had moved to her front steps, her phone steady, her face grim. They knew. Somehow, without me saying a word, they all knew this wasn't about a marriage ending. This was something else entirely. Exactly 19 minutes later, a silver sedan pulled up to the curb. The man who stepped out wore a suit that had seen better days, carried a leather briefcase that looked older than me, and had the kind of face that had probably seen every variation of human ugliness the legal system had to offer. He walked up to me with purpose but not urgency and extended his hand. "Mrs. Mitchell. I'm Richard Brennan. Your mother's attorney." He said it loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Loud enough for Derek to hear if he was listening. "He's inside," I said simply. Richard nodded and walked straight to the front door. He didn't knock. He rang the doorbell 3 times, hard and insistent like a cop might. I could hear Derek's footsteps stomping through the house. The door swung open and Derek filled the frame, his face already red. "Who the hell are you? This is private property. You're trespassing." "Actually," Richard said, his voice carrying that particular tone lawyers use when they're about to ruin someone's day, "you're the one trespassing. I'm here on behalf of the legal property owner." He held up a thick manila envelope. "These are for you. I suggest you read them carefully. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises." Derek's face went from red to purple. "What are you talking about? This is my house. I've lived here for 8 years. My name is on." "Your name is on nothing," Richard interrupted. Your name was removed from the deed 18 months ago through a legal reconveyance process initiated by Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell prior to her death. The house was never jointly owned. It was inherited by Eleanor from her parents in 1987, and she transferred sole ownership to her daughter, Sarah Mitchell, in a recorded deed dated March 15 of last year. You currently have no legal right to be here, let alone change the locks or remove the actual owner's belongings. I watched Derek's face change. The purple drained away, leaving him pale, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Behind him, Vanessa had appeared in the hallway, still wearing my robe, her expression shifting from smug confidence to confusion. That's impossible, Derek finally managed. That's not, Eleanor would have told me. Sarah would have. Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell wasn't required to inform you of her estate planning decisions. And given the documentation we have regarding your activities during her final illness, I'd say her discretion was both warranted and wise. Richard pulled out a second sheet of paper. This is a temporary restraining order, effective immediately. You are not to dispose of, damage, or remove any property from these premises beyond your personal clothing and effects. Any violation will result in immediate arrest. Derek snatched the papers from Richard's hand, his eyes scanning frantically. I could see the moment he hit the relevant section because his entire body went rigid. His eyes shot to me wide and disbelieving. You knew, he said, his voice cracking. You've known this whole time and you didn't say anything. I found out 3 months ago, I replied, still sitting on my suitcase on the lawn. Mom's attorney contacted me after the estate settled. Sent me copies of everything. The new deed. The trust documents. The investigation report. Investigation. Vanessa spoke for the first time, her voice higher than I remembered. What investigation? Richard smiled, and it wasn't friendly. Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell hired a private investigator in the last year of her life. She documented quite extensively the affair between Mr. Mitchell and yourself, including dates, locations, and the rather unfortunate timing of your meetings, specifically during hospital visits and hospice care sessions. He pulled out a third document. We have photographs. Time-stamped, geotagged, including the evening of March 3rd when Mr. Mitchell told his wife he was staying late at the office to handle paperwork, but was actually at the Marriott downtown. That was the same night Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell fell in her bathroom and Sarah had to call an ambulance alone because her husband wasn't answering his phone. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping. Derek's hand holding the papers was shaking. He looked at the house, then back at me, then at the papers again. How much of this did Eleanor know? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. All of it, Richard answered. She knew for approximately 6 months before she passed. She watched you pretend to support your wife while betraying her. She documented your financial negligence, your emotional abandonment, and your continued deception. And then she made absolutely certain you would never be able to take anything else from her daughter. Derek stumbled backward, bumping into Vanessa, who wrapped her arms around herself. My robe, my mother's gift, suddenly looked obscene on her. There's more, Richard continued, and I heard the shift in his tone. This was the part even I didn't know about yet. Mr. Mitchell, we've also uncovered some concerning financial irregularities that need to be addressed. Over the past 3 years, you've attempted to take out several loans using this property as collateral. Derek's face, which had started to regain some color, went white again. That's standard. Homeowners do that all the time. Homeowners who actually own the home, yes. But you didn't own this home. Which means you forged property documents. Specifically, you forged Mrs. Sarah Mitchell's signature on a refinance application 2 years ago, and on a home equity loan application 14 months ago. The lenders are being notified as we speak, and they'll be looking to you personally for repayment. We're looking at approximately $127,000 in fraudulent loans. The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt my breath catch. $127,000. Derek had been stealing from the house. From me. From my mother's legacy. And I'd had no idea. I needed that money, Derek said, but his voice had lost all its fight. The business had some setbacks. I was going to pay it back. I was fixing things. By forging your wife's signature? By committing fraud. Richard's voice was ice. Mr. Mitchell, those lenders are going to pursue you personally. This isn't going to disappear. And given that Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell caught you in the act. Yes, she knew about that too. She restructured everything to protect her daughter from your financial crimes. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady. Mom knew. She knew he was forging my name. Richard turned to me and his expression softened just slightly. She found the documents in January of last year. You were at the hospital overnight with her, remember? She'd asked Derek to bring her some papers from her home office. He apparently took that opportunity to search for financial documents. She had a small security camera in the office. Something she installed after her neighbor had a break-in. He saw everything. Watched him photograph the deed, take copies of your signature from joint tax returns. That's when she contacted me. My mother. Dying, exhausted, in pain, and she'd spent her final months protecting me from the man I'd trusted. The man I'd married. The man who was supposed to love me the way she did. I need to sit down, I said, and Mrs. Patterson's chair was suddenly under me, her hand on my back. Derek was looking at his feet now, the papers hanging limply in his hand. Vanessa had backed away from him, her expression shifting from confusion to calculation. She was doing the math, I realized. Adding up the debt, the fraud, the legal consequences. Measuring the man she'd helped destroy a marriage for against the reality of what he actually was. There's one more thing, Richard said, reaching into his briefcase one final time. He pulled out a cream-colored envelope, my name written on it in my mother's careful handwriting. Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell left this for you. She wanted you to have it today specifically. She anticipated this scenario. The locks changed, the eviction attempt. She set up a trigger with the county recorder's office. The moment any changes were filed regarding this property without your authorization, I was automatically notified. She knew her son-in-law well enough to predict exactly how this would play out. I took the envelope with shaking hands. My mother's handwriting. The last words she'd ever write to me. I wanted to tear it open immediately. I wanted to wait until I was alone. I wanted to scream and cry and rage at the unfairness of it all. That she'd had to spend her final days protecting me instead of just being my mother, just letting me care for her without this weight. Can I read this inside? I asked. In my house. Richard smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. It's your house, Mrs. Mitchell. You can do whatever you want in it. I stood and walked past Derek. He didn't move. Didn't try to stop me. Just stood there holding those papers, his entire world crumbling around him while Vanessa edged further and further away. I climbed the 3 concrete steps where my suitcase had tumbled just half an hour ago. The front door was still open. Mrs. Patterson had already started gathering my spilled belongings, folding my mother's quilt with gentle hands. Mr. Kolsky was calling someone, probably his daughter who worked for the DA's office. Jenny Morrison had lowered her phone but hadn't deleted the video. They'd all seen it. All recorded it. Evidence of Derek's illegal eviction. Proof of my right to return. I stepped into my house, my mother's house, now mine, and the familiar smell hit me. Coffee and vanilla, the candles I always bought. But underneath it, something sour. The smell of betrayal, of violations I couldn't name yet. Vanessa's perfume in the hallway. Strange shoes by the door. A jacket I didn't recognize on the coat rack. How long had this been going on? How many times had they been here together while I worked double shifts at the hospital, trying to pay for treatments that would buy my mother a few more months, a few more days? How many times had Derek brought her into our home, into our bed, into the space my mother had fought so hard to protect for me? I walked through the living room, past the couch where Mom had spent her final weeks when the stairs became too difficult. Past the bookshelf full of her favorite novels, the ones she'd read to me as a child and then again when she could no longer hold the books herself. Into the kitchen where we'd had our last real conversation, where she'd held my hand and told me she was proud of me, that I was stronger than I knew. She'd known then. Known about Derek, about Vanessa, about the forgery. And she'd smiled at me and told me I was strong enough to handle what was coming. I sat at the kitchen table, her table, the one she'd inherited from her own mother, and opened the envelope. The letter inside was 3 pages, written in the careful script that had deteriorated over her final months as the pain medications made her hands shake. But every word was legible. Every word was intentional. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then I was right about Derek. I wish I hadn't been. I wish I could have been wrong about this one last thing before I left you. But I wasn't, and I'm so deeply sorry for that. I want you to know that discovering the truth about your husband wasn't what hurt me most in those final months. What hurt was watching you sacrifice everything, your sleep, your health, your happiness, to care for me while he was betraying you. You would come home from the hospital, exhausted beyond measure, and tell me about your day. You'd smile and say Derek was holding down the fort, taking care of things at home, being supportive. And I would have to smile back and pretend I didn't know the truth. But I couldn't tell you. Not then. You had too much on your plate and I needed you to focus on the time we had left, not on his betrayal. So I decided to handle it myself in the only way I could. The house has always been in my name alone. Did you know that? Your father and I bought it together in 1987, but when he passed, it became solely mine. When you married Derek, he assumed he'd been added to the deed. I let him assume that. But I never did it. Something about him always made me hesitate. I told myself I was being overprotective, that every mother worries about her daughter's husband. But instinct matters, Sarah. Mine was right. When I hired the private investigator and confirmed the affair, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Absolute clarity. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I transferred the house entirely into your name through an irrevocable trust. I made sure Derek's name was never attached to it. I documented his affair, his financial negligence, his forgery of your signature. And I set up a system with Richard to protect you the moment Derek showed his true colors completely. I wish I could be there to hold you when you read this. I wish I could tell you in person that this is not your fault. Derek's betrayal is his choice, his character flaw, his failure. You are not responsible for another person's capacity for deception. There's something else in this envelope. A check for $40,000. It's money I saved by refusing certain treatments in my final months. Treatments that would have extended my life by perhaps 6 to 8 weeks but would have left me in agony and left you in debt. I chose to leave this world a little sooner in less pain and give you freedom instead. I know you'll want to argue with that choice. You'll feel guilty, like you should have insisted on those treatments, fought harder, done more. But Sarah, you did everything. You gave me the greatest gift, your presence. You stayed. You held my hand. You read to me. You made me laugh even when I could barely breathe. You were exactly the daughter I'd always hoped I'd raise. Derek left you during the hardest time of your life. That shows you who he is. This house, this money, this legal protection. It shows you who I am. Who we are. Women who stand by each other. Women who protect what matters. Use the money however you need. Pay off debts, take time off work, travel somewhere I always meant to take you. Or, and I think you'll like this idea. Use it to help other women who are going through what you're going through. Start something. Build something. Create a space where women can find their strength again. The house remembers loyalty, Sarah. It remembers who stayed and who left. It remembers every meal we cooked together, every holiday we celebrated, every quiet evening when you sat with me and just let me be your mother. Derek was never truly part of that. He was a guest who overstayed his welcome. Now you get to decide what happens next. You have the power. You have the resources. You have the legal right to every inch of that property. And you have my absolute faith that you will build something beautiful from this wreckage. I love you more than any words can express. I'm proud of the woman you are. And I'll be watching over you, cheering you on as you reclaim your life and build something better than Derek could ever imagine. The house is yours. Your life is yours. Choose wisely who you let into both. With all my love, always. Please keep the quilt. It was your grandmother's and her mother's before that. For generations of strong women, all loving you. We're not going anywhere. I read the letter 3 times before the tears finally came. Not because Derek had thrown my belongings onto the lawn. Not because of the affair or the forgery or the betrayal. But because my mother, dying and in pain, had spent her final months protecting me. Had chosen to leave this world sooner than necessary so I could have freedom. Had loved me enough to handle the ugliness so I wouldn't have to face it alone. The check fluttered out from between the pages. $40,000 made out to me, dated the week before she died. Money she'd saved by suffering less relief, fewer pain medications, shorter hospice care. Money she'd chosen to leave me instead of spending on herself. I heard footsteps behind me and tensed, but it was Richard Brennan, not Derek. I gave your husband the full documentation, he said quietly. The loan information, the fraud charges, the evidence of the affair. He and his companion are gathering his belongings now. He's asked for the full 72 hours to find alternative housing. And the girlfriend? I asked, my voice rough from crying. Richard's expression turned grim. There's something else you need to know about her. Something that came to light during the background check your mother requested. I looked up at him, exhausted. What else could there possibly be? Vanessa isn't just having an affair with your husband. She's still legally married. Has been for 12 years. 2 children, ages 8 and 10, living with her husband in Ohio. This is her 3rd time pulling this exact scheme, targeting married men with property, moving in, attempting to establish common law marriage rights or cohabitation claims, then taking them for everything in the inevitable settlement. The words didn't make sense at first. I blinked at Richard, trying to process. She's married? With kids. Her husband, Thomas, has been looking for her for 8 months. She emptied their joint account and left. He's been trying to serve her with divorce papers and custody modification documents. I took the liberty of contacting him when your mother's investigation revealed Vanessa's real identity. He's on his way here now. Should arrive within the hour. I started laughing. I couldn't help it. The situation was so absurd, so completely ridiculous, that laughter was the only response that made sense. Derek hadn't just destroyed our marriage for an affair. He'd destroyed it for a woman who was scamming him. A woman who'd probably targeted him deliberately, assessed his assets, manipulated her way into his life with the explicit goal of taking everything. And he'd thought he was the one in control. Thought he was the one calling the shots. Does Derek know? I asked. Not yet. I thought you might want to be there when Thomas arrives. It's your house after all. Your choice whether to allow that conversation to happen here. I thought about it. Thought about Derek's face when he'd opened the door to Richard. Thought about Vanessa's careful manipulation, her performance at the holiday party, the way she'd worn my robe like a trophy. Thought about my mother, spending her final months protecting me from people who'd seen me as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome. Let Thomas come, I said. I want Derek to see exactly what he traded his marriage for. I want him to understand the depth of his own stupidity. Richard nodded approvingly. Your mother would have said the same thing. She was always strategic, even at the end. We went back outside together. Derek had piled his clothes into garbage bags. Apparently he hadn't thought to keep suitcases here, and was loading them into his car. Vanessa stood by the front door, still wearing my robe, her face tight with calculation. She'd heard Richard mention the fraud charges. She was probably already planning her exit strategy, figuring out how to distance herself from Derek's legal troubles. The neighbors were still watching. Mrs. Patterson had brought me my suitcases, carefully repacked. Mr. Kowalski had made coffee and was sharing it with Jenny Morrison. They'd formed a protective semicircle around my property line, witnesses to whatever came next. Derek slammed his trunk closed and turned to face me. Satisfied, he spat. You get the house. You get everything. I hope it was worth destroying our marriage over. I didn't destroy anything, I replied calmly. You did that all on your own. I just stopped pretending not to notice. Your mother poisoned you against me. She never liked me, never gave me a chance. My mother died protecting me from you, I interrupted. She spent her final months gathering evidence of your betrayal instead of just resting. She chose to suffer more so I could have less debt and more freedom. She loved me enough to handle the ugly truth alone so I could focus on being her daughter. You couldn't even manage to be faithful while I was helping her die. Derek's mouth worked soundlessly. Vanessa had edged toward her own car, a small sedan I'd never seen before. She was calculating her escape, I realized. Probably already composing the story she'd tell the next Mark, the next married man she'd target. That's when the pickup truck pulled up. The man who got out was tall, broad-shouldered, with the exhausted look of someone who'd been searching too long for something they'd lost. He had 2 children with him, a boy and a girl, both elementary school age. They stayed in the truck, but I could see their faces pressed against the windows, searching. Vanessa, the man said, his voice rough but controlled. We need to talk. Vanessa went absolutely still. All the calculation, all the confidence drained from her face in an instant. She looked between Thomas, Derek, and the truck with her children inside, and I watched her realize there was no way out. No story that would work. No manipulation that would save her. Who the hell is this? Derek demanded, looking between Thomas and Vanessa. Vanessa, who is he? My name is Thomas Morrison, the man said, pulling out a folder from his truck. I'm Vanessa's husband. Have been for 12 years. These are our children, Emma and Jack. And these are divorce papers and custody modification documents I've been trying to serve her for 8 months. The silence was deafening. Derek's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, shock, and finally comprehension. He turned to Vanessa slowly. "You're married," he said flatly. "You have kids." "It's not what you think," Vanessa started, but Thomas cut her off. "It's exactly what he thinks. This is what you do, Vanessa. You find married men with assets, move in with them, establish residency, then claim common law marriage or cohabitation rights when things fall apart. You did it in Ohio before we got married. You did it in Pennsylvania 3 years ago. Yes, I found out about that. And now here. You were never going to stay with him, Derek. You were going to take him for everything and move on to the next one." Derek stumbled backward, his hand going to his chest like he'd been struck. "You told me you loved me. You told me we were building a life together. You told your wife you were working late while you were with me." Vanessa shot back, her voice turning vicious now that her cover was blown. "You're not exactly innocent here, Derek. You wanted this. You wanted someone who made you feel young and important. Well, congratulations. You got exactly what you deserved." Thomas approached Vanessa with the papers. "You need to sign these. You need to come back to Ohio and face the custody hearing. Emma and Jack deserve better than this. They deserve a mother who doesn't keep disappearing to scam married men." The children in the truck were crying now. I could see them through the windows, the boy with his arm around his younger sister, both of them watching their mother face the consequences of her choices. My heart broke for them in a way it hadn't broken for myself. They hadn't chosen any of this. They were just collateral damage in their mother's endless pursuit of easy money and stolen lives. Vanessa snatched the papers from Thomas, her hands shaking. "Fine. I'll sign them. I'll go back. But I'm not giving up custody." "You abandoned them," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You emptied our bank account and left them without a word. The court isn't going to give you anything beyond supervised visitation, and that's only if you're lucky." Derek was still staring at Vanessa like he'd never seen her before. "You were using me," he said slowly, the reality finally sinking in. "This whole time. Everything you said, everything we did." "Oh, grow up," Vanessa snapped, stripping off my robe and throwing it on the ground. Underneath she wore jeans and a tank top, clothes clearly ready for a quick exit. "You think you were special? You think what we had was real? You're just another man who thought he deserved more than he had. You were convenient. That's all." She grabbed a small bag from inside the house. Apparently she kept a go bag ready just in case and stormed to her car. Thomas followed her with the papers, his face grim. They had a quick, harsh exchange I couldn't hear, and then Vanessa was peeling out of the driveway, her car leaving rubber on the street. Thomas stood there for a moment watching her go, then turned to Derek. "I'd say I'm sorry, but honestly, you helped her abandon her children. You knew she was married." "I didn't know," Derek insisted, but his voice was weak. "She told me she was divorced. That her ex was abusive. I thought I was helping her escape." "She told you what you wanted to hear," Thomas interrupted. "Same thing she told the guy in Pennsylvania. Same thing she probably told whoever came before him. You weren't rescuing anyone. You were just easy." Thomas walked back to his truck, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Before he climbed in, he looked at me. "I'm sorry you got caught up in this. My wife, ex-wife, she destroys lives. It's what she does. I hope you land on your feet." "I will," I said and meant it. "Take care of those kids." He nodded and drove away. The boy and girl in the back seat turned to watch through the rear window, their faces still tear-stained. I wondered what kind of therapy they'd need. What kind of trust issues they'd carry. How many years it would take for them to feel secure again. Derek stood in the driveway, surrounded by garbage bags full of his belongings, his face the color of old newspaper. All his confidence, all his control, all his assumptions about how this day would go, shattered. He'd thrown my suitcase on the lawn thinking he was the victor. Thinking he'd won. Instead he'd lost everything. The house was mine. His girlfriend was a con artist fleeing from divorce papers and custody battles. He owed over $100,000 in fraudulent loans that would follow him forever. And every neighbor on the street had watched it happen, recorded it, witnessed his complete destruction. "I need to go," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I need to figure out where I'm staying." "You have 72 hours, Richard reminded him. "Use them to remove your personal effects. Anything left after that becomes property of the homeowner and will be disposed of. Derek nodded mechanically and went back inside. I heard him moving around, opening drawers, pulling clothes from closets. The sounds of a life being dismantled. The sounds of consequences arriving. Mrs. Patterson brought me a fresh cup of coffee. "Your mother was a smart woman," she said quietly. "She knew exactly what she was doing." "She always did," I agreed, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "Even when I didn't see it." Mr. Kowalski approached with his phone. "I've sent the videos to my daughter. She works in the DA's office. Given the fraud charges and the illegal eviction attempt, they'll want this as evidence. Is that okay with you?" "More than okay," I said. "Thank you, all of you, for being here. For recording this. For not looking away." "That's what neighbors do," Jenny Morrison said, joining us. "We look out for each other. Your mother used to help me with my garden every spring. Said it reminded her of her own mother teaching her to plant. I owed her. And I owe you. Anything you need, you just ask." Derek emerged an hour later with the last of his bags. He wouldn't look at me. Wouldn't look at any of the neighbors. Just loaded everything into his car with mechanical precision, his face blank, his movements stiff. When he finally drove away, I felt something release in my chest. A tension I'd been carrying for months, maybe years, without realizing it. The weight of suspicion, of ignored instincts, of choosing to believe comfortable lies instead of facing uncomfortable truths. The house stood behind me, solid and certain. My house. My mother's house. For generations of women who'd loved and protected each other. Derek had never really belonged here. He'd just been passing through, a temporary occupant who'd mistaken presence for ownership. Richard handed me a complete folder of documents. "Everything you need is here. The deed, the trust paperwork, the restraining order, the evidence of fraud. I've also included contact information for a good divorce attorney and a financial advisor who can help you navigate your mother's final gift. She wanted you to have options, Sarah. She wanted you to have choices." I took the folder, its weight somehow comforting. Solid proof that my mother's love extended beyond death. That she'd thought of everything, planned for everything, protected me even from threats she knew I wouldn't see coming. "Thank you," I said. "For helping her. For being here today. For doing exactly what she asked." "It was an honor," Richard replied. "Your mother was one of the sharpest people I've ever met. Even at the end, even in pain, her mind was crystal clear. She knew exactly what she wanted and how to make it happen. You come from good stock, Mrs. Mitchell. Don't forget that." After Richard left, I stood in my front yard for a long time looking at the house. It needed work. The paint was fading. The garden had been neglected during my mother's illness and my long hospital shifts. The gutters probably needed cleaning. But it was mine. Completely, legally, unquestionably mine. And I knew exactly what my mother would want me to do with it. The next morning, I called in sick to the hospital for the first time in 3 years. Then I called my supervisor and asked about the Employee Assistance Program resources. I knew other women at work were going through divorces, dealing with betrayals, navigating the aftermath of marriages that had crumbled. I'd seen them in the break room, exhausted and alone, trying to hold it together. Within a week, I'd made contact with 5 women from my department who were facing similar situations. We met at my house, my mother's house, on a Saturday afternoon. We sat in the living room where Mom had spent her final weeks, and we talked. Really talked. About the signs we'd missed. The red flags we'd ignored. The ways we'd been manipulated and the strength we'd found to survive. That first meeting of what would become the second chapter society. By month 3 we had 15 regular members. Women from the hospital, from the neighborhood, from friends of friends who'd heard about the group through whispered conversations in grocery stores and coffee shops. We talked about practical things. Property rights, financial planning, divorce proceedings, custody arrangements. But we also talked about the emotional aftermath. The grief of losing not just a partner but the future you'd imagined. The shame that comes with admitting you'd been deceived. The slow, painful work of rebuilding trust in yourself and others. I used part of my mother's $40,000 to hire a lawyer who specialized in helping women navigate contentious divorces. She came to the house once a month to answer questions and review cases pro bono for any woman who couldn't afford her regular fees. Another portion went to a financial advisor who taught classes on financial literacy and independence. The rest I saved, knowing there would be emergencies, situations where one of us needed help and had nowhere else to turn. Derek's divorce papers came quickly. He didn't contest anything. Couldn't afford to contest anything really, given the fraud charges and the debt he'd accumulated. He'd moved into a basement apartment across town and was working a second job to pay down the loans he'd taken out illegally. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd aged 10 years in 6 months. That he barely spoke to anyone. That he'd become a cautionary tale at his office. I didn't feel sorry for him. But I didn't feel the burning rage I'd expected either. Mostly I felt relief. Relief that my mother had protected me. Relief that I'd gotten out before Derek could do more damage. Relief that the house, this space that held 4 generations of women's memories, had been saved. Vanessa disappeared completely. Thomas got full custody of Emma and Jack, and from what I heard through the small-town gossip network that connected us all, the kids were doing better. Therapy, stability, their father's unwavering presence. It was helping. I sent Thomas a card 6 months after everything happened, just a simple note saying I hoped they were healing. He sent back a photo of the kids smiling on the first day of school. No words necessary. 18 months after Derek threw my suitcase on the lawn, I hosted Thanksgiving at the house. 23 women came, plus some of their children, plus Mrs. Patterson and her husband, plus Mr. Kowalski and his daughter from the DA's office, plus Jenny Morrison and her teenage son. We filled every room, every chair, every surface with food and laughter and the kind of chaotic joy that comes from people who've survived something terrible and come out the other side. I'd started dating again carefully. A man named David who taught high school English and had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier. He understood grief. Understood the complicated process of rebuilding. Understood that some days you were fine and some days you absolutely weren't, and both were okay. We took things slow, met for coffee, talked about our late mothers and dead marriages and the strange courage it takes to try again. He came to Thanksgiving. Brought homemade bread and his daughter, a college freshman studying social work who'd heard about the Second Chapter Society and wanted to volunteer. She and I talked for an hour about the need for support systems, about the isolation women feel when their marriages implode, about the shame that keeps so many silent. "You're building something important here," she told me. My mom would have needed something like this. She had nowhere to go when things got bad. No one to talk to who'd understand. "That's why we do it," I said simply. "So no one has to go through it alone." That night, after everyone had left and David had kissed me goodnight at the door, I went upstairs to my bedroom. On the wall beside my bed in a simple wooden frame hung my mother's letter. I'd kept it there since the day Richard had given it to me. Some mornings I read it. Some mornings I just looked at it, drawing strength from her words even though she was gone. "The house remembers loyalty, Sarah." I looked around the room. At the walls that had sheltered 4 generations of women. At the window that overlooked the garden I'd slowly brought back to life. At the space that had seen so much pain and so much healing. The house did remember. It remembered who stayed and who left. It remembered my mother's quiet strength in her final months. It remembered the women who gathered here every week to support each other. It remembered laughter and tears and the slow, steady work of rebuilding broken lives. And it would keep remembering long after I was gone. Another chapter in the story of women who protected each other. Who refused to be defeated. Who chose loyalty, community, and love over the easy lie of someone else's promises. I fell asleep that night thinking about my mother's final words. About power and choices and the legacy of women who fought for each other. About the difference between being someone's victim and being someone's daughter. Derek had tried to take everything. But he'd never understood what mattered. The house wasn't just property. It was proof that love persists. That protection continues. That some bonds cannot be broken even by death. My mother had given me more than a home. She'd given me the freedom to build a life on my own terms. To help others do the same. To transform betrayal into purpose and pain into power. The house remembered loyalty. And so would I. If this story of calculated justice had you holding your breath, smash that like button right now. My favorite part was when Richard revealed the photos from the private investigator. And Derek's face went completely white. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification